Hey everybody, welcome back. We've got John Haney in the studio again today.
Hello.
We're going to continue the conversation we started a couple of weeks ago about re-engaging sexually after an infidelity. And this time we're going to talk specifically about what it's like for the unfaithful spouse. So welcome back.
Thank you.
It's always good to be with you.
It's good to be with you, my friend.
Yeah, thanks. So, you and I deal with this every day, and we get some comments and some questions about specifically the challenges that unfaithful spouses have when they re-engage sexually, especially if they've been abstinent for anywhere from a few weeks to even a year or two. What are some of the biggest challenges that you see that the unfaithful spouse has as they try to re-engage intimately, sexually in their married life?
I guess my probably number one answer with that would just be patience, because it's both parties can be incredibly frustrated. It can feel like, watching, grass grow or something. It's so hard to see the movement sometimes. But as we're talking to the unfaithful here, I think, I would often try to encourage them or coach them just to really try to see it from their partner's perspective about just what this journey has been like and some of the challenges that have come about for them in trying to deal with this. Because, we talked last time about just how potent a trigger sex can be in terms of reminders of what happened. And I would want to say with that, that's not even necessarily just for sexual affairs. I think when there's been an intense emotional connection, the closeness that we're trying to have with our sexual union oftentimes will kind of create that same trigger that, oh my gosh, this person got so close to you, even if they didn't touch physically. And so just trying to be wary of that and trying to help their partner negotiate that.
Patience all the way around, right? With yourself, with your spouse, with everybody. That goes a long way. I tell couples a lot of times to go slow, and that requires some patience, because when you slow down, you start to make some progress. Instead of trying to get past this or move beyond it, we just keep going around and around and around and around the same thing, right? And it's just that patience is so vitally important.
It is, and I think what you say is dead on. I mean, encouraging people to try to go slow with that. Mm-hmm. And I know sometimes the fear is with some people that maybe we're going too slow, that we're not pressing in enough and trying to find that sweet spot where we're pushing into the discomfort a little bit,
right.
but not extending further than we can reach. Or I know sometimes in the interest of wanting things to be back the way they were, that sometimes people will try the fake it till you make it kind of thing, and it doesn't work so well, or they will sometimes, I think, even potentially more destructively, they'll hide what they're really feeling because they want the experience to be normal for their mate again, or they want it to be good for their mate again, and so they'll quietly just hold on to the fears or the anxieties or the triggering memories or anything, and won't always share them. So I think openness is another big piece of this. How do we make it safe to communicate about what's going on with us? And I think that's an element of good sex anywhere, and one of the ones that most of us struggle with the most anyway.
Mm-hmm. When you say openness, what kinds of, is there some practical or, I'm struggling with the right word, but practical tools or practical ways that a couple can practice that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
And I think it's just, getting outside of our comfort zones and daring to start talking about the things that we've always traditionally held back. And I think sex in many ways, as far as my experience with couples, tends to be the last great frontier. I mean, it just seems like see couples that can talk about anything that's going on with the kids. Right. They can talk about, really difficult issues with their work, or even things going on with them intrapersonally and all of that. But like when it comes to sex, particularly when it comes to our own sexual shame about what we don't like about our bodies and things like that, people have the hardest time doing that. And there needs to be obviously a degree of emotional safety that's there to be able to talk about that. And I think that's one of the problems in this dynamic is the emotional safety feels like it's been compromised by the betrayal. And so, someone can be even more gun shy about stepping back into that. But I think just getting some practice with that, starting to talk about that. And there are some nice systematic tools that you and I have both used before, like books that we like and things like that can help guide people down that pathway of what what good sexual communication can look like. A book that Wayne and I and Leslie and Rick and the whole team basically, use sometimes, a book called Restoring the Pleasure, which has a full-blown sexual retraining in it. The whole most of the second half of the book is a set of kind of very scripted guidelines that I think could be beneficial to anybody doing something like this, because talk last time about how practice sometimes doesn't make perfect, sometimes practice makes permanent. We just start doing it a certain way. We don't then feel like we always have permission to talk about it afterwards, since we've, especially if we've been kind of having that same choreography for 3 or 4 decades, we don't always feel like we have permission to kind of step in there and say, hey, this never really was working that well for me. And I think there's an opportunity in that we get kind of a do-over, in a sense that none of us does this perfectly. And since most of us don't talk about it, we actually have an opportunity here to start talking about things that weren't working for us.
I know that is so vitally important. I mean, we could probably talk about this for a long time, but the need to have conversations around this. And also, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about reviewing your own sexual history. And I know we're trying to focus on the unfaithful spouse, and sometimes that's hard to do because the blending that goes on there. But if you are the unfaithful spouse, to review your whole sexual history. When did you discover sex? How did your parents talk about that? How did they deal with that kind of thing? And there's some good questions in this Restoring the Pleasure, right?
Completely. And I couldn't agree more with what you're saying. In fact, I know Leslie's really big on that idea too, about like, she encourages, her betrayed men and women to and the unfaithfuls as well, to journal about those sorts of things, write about them, explore them. What you're talking about is a process we call sexualization. It's like, kind of how we came to know about sexuality, what we were introduced to at what age, and how we were introduced to it. And it's all those things that came together that impact our later sense of our own sexuality. And if we grew up in any kind of shame-based paradigm around sex, or there was a kind of a certain ignorance because we just didn't have the chance to explore it in a way that other kids maybe had a chance to explore it, or if we explored it in a way that we have a lot of shame around, if we looked at a lot of porn or did some experimentation, a lot of times we will carry some of that shame into our adult lives, and then by extension into our bedrooms with our mate. And I think it's a wonderful chance to try to reintegrate our sexuality in a sense that it's not just a set of actions that we're doing with each other, but it's more of an extension of who we are. We're connecting on a soul level, not just on a behavioral level, if that makes any sense to anybody.
Well, it makes sense to me, and I think the connection back to ourself too. I'm thinking about, when I was unfaithful, and I had to do some work around this with Rick, around the way I was sexualized and my own sexual abuse, and how that came to light that I had just pushed aside and minimized. And I just had a conversation with a man, very similar. We talk about this a lot, that when you go through this infidelity and recovery of that, so much of this comes to light. And we just really want to encourage people to go review that with somebody that can help you, not just, sit around and think about the questions, but write it down and go review it with somebody that knows how to help.
I'm a big fan of that. And like everything else with this, trying to do it, kind of non-judgmentally and all of that, because, as we talk so often about how in affairs people have, in essence, eroticized their wounds, often what we find, is that, that the way people were acting out in their affairs were kind of an extension of an old trauma, or, and not to say that everybody experienced sexual abuse, although a lot of people did, men and women. But sometimes if we had that absent father figure or mother figure, or if we had, just this certain kinds of wounds and even kind of attachment issues that we brought from childhood, sometimes that's what we end up playing out in our affair behavior. So I think that's wonderful soil to start digging into to understand, what was driving some of that behavior.
So the other question I have then is, for the unfaithful spouse, and they are reengaging with their spouse, what are the differences? Again, we could talk about this forever, but
we could.
I'm just curious about From the unfaithful man versus the unfaithful woman, the challenges, do you see any differences there?
I think there's a lot of overlap, but there is and by the way, this is another case of that no one size fits all phenomenon.
Yeah.
But to me, the most problematic one is, as I'm working with a lot of betrayed men, is the depth to which a lot of unfaithful women get involved with their affair partners. Mm-hmm. The level of emotional decommitment from their primary relationship, and then their ability to kind of go all in with the affair partner. And then, even when they're choosing the marriage, I just get, we talk about that patience word, mm-hmm. Get so many men who've been betrayed who feel like, it's just taking their wives forever to come back online. And I do want to normalize that for, mm-hmm. for those of you ladies who are struggling with that yourselves right now, and for the guys who are as well. For men, sometimes, for betrayed men, that journey can just seem like an eternity before their wives' hearts seem to reengage and all of that. And as part of that, I know this is a really painful thing to talk about, but one of the things that has to be addressed is what happens when the unfaithful man or woman still has feelings for mm-hmm. the affair partner, or if they're still feeling an addictive pull to the pornography or whatever the case may be. The specter of that person or that set of actions is still very much in the bedroom, even when the person's trying to connect with their mate. And I'd be curious kind of, what you think about that, how you handle that. But, sometimes I coach that, we don't want to be the betrayed partner to be in the position of having to kind of therapeutically work through the feelings or the longing or the, whatever kind of residual echo that the person's feeling for the affair, that they have somebody that the betrayed partner can trust, that they're working with, a therapist, a good life coach or a mentor, a sponsor, or someone they really trust in their church life group, but somebody who can help them, come alongside of them and create some accountability for them with that.
I approach it as grief work, that unfaithful spouse, if they're still holding on to some feelings, is work through the grief of that. And there's some great books out there that can help that aren't even related to sexual things, but the Grief Recovery Handbook or Grieving Mindfully, just to give you some context, right? I mean, that's how I kind of see it a lot of times. And if they have somebody to talk to that's safe and their spouse knows they're talking and processing that, most of the time it moves pretty quick. I mean, quickly to you and I is 4 to 6 months,
right, right.
That may seem like eternity to some people.
I love that answer. No, I really do, because I think grief is such a critical part of this. And we're speaking largely to the unfaithful here, but to the betrayed, I would say on that don't necessarily assume that what they're grieving is just that person. Right. It's often much more symbolically what that person represented, the sense of freedom that I thought I got with that I felt was being restricted in another part of my life that had nothing to do with the marriage or whatever, that It's not, like with so much with this, it's not what it looks like on the surface.
Or how I felt about myself.
Yes.
That's a big one that I see a lot. Yeah. What about issues around desire, specifically for the unfaithful spouse, the struggles that they may have for desire with their mate, or the desire to reengage sexually?
Oh man, that's a huge, huge question.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many ramifications to this one. And preface this again by saying that desire is probably the most problematic word in the sex therapy community. No one's really fully figured it out or all of that. And we'll talk a little bit more too about making that distinction between desire and arousal once again, how they're completely different things. But desire can be compromised by lots of things. And like so many other things here, it's often not what it appears to be. That when betrayed wife or husband is with their mate and their mate suddenly seems emotionally distanced or in many cases having a hard time performing sexually or whatever, oftentimes the immediate assumption is they're not attracted to me, they're still thinking about the affair partner and all, and there may be elements of things here and there, but again, not usually what it looks like on the surface. But I think one of the biggest factors that can play into a loss of desire on the unfaithful's part is guilt, mm-hmm. and when we see this person that we love dearly and who stuck by us and was there for us, and they're desperately wanting to to connect with us physically in some cases. Some cases want to normalize that they're not, and that's pretty typical too. But oftentimes that that can feel so convicting and so overwhelming that just the weight of that compromises the desire in that situation. It makes it very, very difficult to be with them, because one of the distinctions we try to draw anyway, one of the reasons why it's such an unfair comparison to compare affairs and real intimacy and that you might have in a marriage, is that there's a certain degree of vulnerability, a much, much deeper degree of vulnerability that comes with the real intimacy. And there's with it a much higher need for exposure and honesty and all these kinds of things, which puts a much deeper weight on it. It's one of the reasons why when sex is in a good place in a marriage, in an intimate marriage, it's a far, far deeper kind of phenomenon than you would ever have in limerence or in an affair. I don't care how long they've been together or how much they think they're each other's soulmates. Or
we fight that battle almost daily, don't we?
Right, totally, every day. Yeah. Just the weight of that and the guilt of that can very much compromise desire in that situation. And so it's not uncommon for like unfaithful men to experience erectile issues and things like that with their wives, which sadly almost always gets translated into "you're not attracted to me,"
right?
And because you had no problem doing this with her or whatever, and it's not what it looks like in most cases there. Fear is another huge one, that like fear of disappointing their wife, fear of not being enough, fear of her being triggered or him being triggered during the
Sure.
during the union. Sometimes just going in with that stuff in our head before we even start can shut the whole system down before we even get going. And lack of safety, I think that's one of the biggest ones. It's like safety, particularly for women, but I want to stress this for men as well. Again, don't want to get too gender specific on this, because there's a lot of men who this impacts the same way. But like one of the things that comes up in feminine sexuality very often is like a lot of women's desire is highly, highly correlated with their sense of safety in the relationship. And so when something's happened that's affected their sense of connection, their sense of safety with their mate, absolutely that can compromise their desire. And the distinction I would want to make with arousal, again, we sometimes, kind of the easy answer is like desire's kind of the more of the mental desire to connect with the other, and arousal is more about the physiological response, the bodily response, getting ready to be with the other. And one of the things that happens very often in this dynamic is it can throw one or both off kilter, and one can be online and not the other. So like we can have a moment where like an unfaithful husband, for example, really wants to be physically intimate with his wife, but his body is just not responding. And that happens with the betrayed very often as well. Or they'll have kind of moments where, one partner can feel like they're kind of in the mood for a physiological release with sex, but their mind can feel like it's still 1,000 miles away. Yeah, and so they end up kind of almost kind of servicing one another, but they don't feel that intimate connection with one another yet. And so I think, it's how do we kind of get that dance back online? How do we create safety enough to alter the context and change it where we can start surrendering to it? But like going back to that fear piece as well, one of the things we talk about with fear sometimes all the time in our EMS weekends and all of that is that fear tends to put us in a future-oriented way of thinking, that it takes us out of that moment. And so it's one of the reasons why, the minute a man starts worrying about losing his erection, it's like so often that's where the problems hit, because that thought registers and he's already so fixated on that he's out of the moment, and suddenly, boom, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. He loses his erection because he's so worried about losing his erection. I think one of the natural kind of antidotes we can start to with dealing with desire issues is mindfulness and getting ourselves back in the moment, or at least trying to do some of that. The old school sex therapy stuff, the old Masters and Johnson stuff, used to talk a lot about things like sensate focus, where you learn how to feel what's going on in your body, and in some ways try to turn this off, because it's not always our friend with what's going on with that.
Well, that's exactly the sensate focus. I have the idea that that's a little bit easier for women than men to do, but men can certainly do it. but it takes some discipline and some practice at that. I think that's good. I think the other thing is around this whole notion of safety. I know I talk about that a lot with my couples, and I think it's a great conversation for couples to have about what makes you feel safe.
I think it's
for both of them, not just sexually, but in our relationship. And I look for things like transparency, commitment, consistency. Those are the kind of things that I think about when it comes to safety.
Oh, I love those words. And I think you're right. I think real sexual safety is built outside the bedroom. Mostly before we even try to build it in the bedroom. It's like, really getting, I think perfect set of words there.
And just to come full circle to where we started, I think everything has got to be bathed in patience for yourself as you get to know your own self again, your own sexual self, spiritual self, relational self, and what you bring, and then what you need and what you're requesting from your spouse, sexually, spiritually, financially, all of that, right? It's all. I don't want to be too simplistic about it.
No, but
it's not
I think
simple. It's not.
It's not simplistic at all. But I think that's a really good overarching kind of answer. And I think one book that I recommend sometimes, particularly for unfaithful men who are trying to understand feminine sexuality and understand how that's working for them, is a book called Come As You Are, which I know you're very familiar with. But it really talks about how important the context of our sexual union is and what's going on with us and all of that. And because I know a lot of the men that I work with kind of see, they think of it from a masculine perspective. Right on. And again, not all men think this way, but oftentimes we can see sex as a kind of a stress reliever, as a kind of a release of a way of kind of taking the edge off the day. Whereas a lot of women, if they're in a stressful environment, if their safety has been compromised, sex is usually the last thing on their minds. And they can't just like flip a switch and suddenly, get into the mood just by lighting a few candles or, putting on some Yanni music or something like that. Like had to drop a Yanni reference in there because we were talking about that yesterday. But
Yes.
Whether the unfaithful is a man or a woman, I think, kind of recognizing that there are some fundamental differences in the way that we sometimes approach sexuality, the whole kind of paradigm. And again, there's no gender absolutes on that, but that's why it's so important to talk about what's normal to us, what were, like you were saying earlier, what were we taught that was normal, and kind of what do we need to challenge with that? What feels kind of, awkward or embarrassing for us, and all those kinds of things. But recognizing, the things that necessarily put us in the mood are not going to be the things that necessarily put our mate in the mood.
Yeah, well, we talk about all the time the differences in the operating systems, and even the differences in the masculine operating system. There's a lot of variety in that, and the feminine operating system. There's a lot of variety in that too.
Indeed.
We're trying to hit a broad brushstroke with all of this to give some people hope more than anything else.
Right, and I'm glad you used that word too, because I think sometimes just stay in the course and like everything else in this process, realizing that what we're trying to get to is far beyond probably what we had before. It's not just, throwing a few Band-Aids on it and getting back to some kind of, core baseline functionality. It's getting to a sexual dynamic that's can be light years beyond what we thought was our best before the infidelity, because that's part of that much deeper intimacy and exposure that, like, if we can really engage this stuff and be honest about some of these hurts and everything that probably never would have come to the surface had we not had them challenged somehow, we can get to a promised land that is the best that we've ever known.
Well, John, thanks again for being here.
Always my pleasure.
Always fun to hang out with you and talk shop and talk about these topics that hopefully bring some life and light and hope to our clients and to the people that watch.